So obviously you were there for the presentation. You saw some of the things reiterated from the State a week ago. What did you learn today?
Well, one thing I learned is a philosophical difference I have with the governor. She's tax and spend. I'm saying let's not tax as much as we do. She's proposing a $260 billion budget. That's an $81 billion increase over the last 5 years. I don't think we can continue this tax and spend that the governor and the one-party rule in Albany has been doing. So that's a concern. Obviously, she's talking about affordability. That's the buzzword that every elected official is talking about. Some things I can support that she's talking about. No tax on tip. Obviously, President Trump's proposed that. Members of my conference have proposed that. So we're happy and say, come on board and happy to do that. We'd like to go farther. You know, the one thing she didn't mention was additional tax cuts. She talked about $3.8 billion of extra revenue that we got in that we didn't expect at the beginning of the year. You know, instead of just taking that money and running and spending it, why not give that back to the taxpayers? That seems very appropriate. And in fact, out years, I think she was up to $11.5 billion, real substantial dollars. Instead of just spending that, like we always do in New York State, I'd prefer to give that back to the taxpayers.
The universal child care question, I think the big concerns were how do you pay for it, infrastructure, workforce. Right. Where are you at after seeing a little bit more on it today?
Well, infrastructure is a big worry of ours. I mean, you can't just throw that money out there. There's not enough people to actually provide the child care. Where are the children going to go? Are they going to go in the schools or these different locales that have to be built up over the time? We do agree that child care in New York is very expensive, and we'd like to work with them to give relief. But our plan is to give the money directly to the parents through tax credits, which a proposal that we passed last year. We'd like to see that increase and give it to tax credits to actually facilities so they can, you know, either make improvements or expand so they can take more. I think their proposal is more of a top-down, where the government's making the decision of how the people, childs are going to be taken care of. So philosophically, we have probably some differences there, but ultimately we understand that child care is very expensive, and we do think there's a role for state government to help relieve those expenses.
Something that didn't come up in the formal but the Q&A was criminal justice reform and raise the age, of which she sort of passed the ball to the chambers, if you will, and the houses themselves to have their own proposal regarding raise the age. I know, I'd imagine what you would like to see, but even the funding mechanism, I'd imagine, would you expect to see anything like that coming out?
You know, very interesting, because on a whole, we'd like the governor to stick with just budgetary matters in the budget appropriately. But the legislature has been so stubborn about making any changes to any criminal justice law, whether it's raise the age, bail reform, halt, any of those things, they refuse to do it. So in order to get these things done, which we feel, and myself and my conference feel very strongly about, the governor's going to have to use some of her political capital. To use that political capital, she should have included something in her budget to force the governor or the legislature's hands to kind of get reform to these pieces of law.
Another big one was the school aid, and that she's going to add on to the whatever everyone gets foundation aid-wise. This was a big conversation 2 years ago now, and I think she had alluded to it a little bit of can we get more out of this, right? Till we get our better results when it comes to education. How does that happen?
Well, I hope that is part of it. You know, I did some quick math when I was listening to her speech. I think she's up to, what'd she say, almost $40 billion in state aid to schools. Obviously, you have the local share, which is probably another $20 billion, maybe more. We're paying on the state level about $16,000 per student. You have the local level, I think we're up around $30,000 or more, and then you get the federal aid in there. So we're spending more per student, I think, well more than the rest of the country. We have to obviously get results for all this money we're spending. So I think it's very appropriate to tie results-based, you know, some sort of, we want to know how they're doing because they're spending a lot of money. You know, there's been efforts to do that in the past. I think some efforts to do that have been questionable. Standardized testing maybe is not the best way, but somehow we want to make sure if we're spending this much money, we better have the best educated students in the country.
One more. Yeah. So the last question on she talked so much about the federal government and the impact it's having on everything in New York State. What do you make of the state's response to that? What do you think it should be moving forward here as we get to the second year of the Trump term?
Well, one thing I said after the State of the State, and maybe after, I mean, you can't blame everything on President Trump. We have one-party rule here. Hochul's been the governor for 4 years. They've had one-party rule in the legislature for 6 or 7 years. They have to take some of the blame, if there is blame. Interesting, the other thing they said, we're doing great, the $3.8 billion I talked about, the stock market, you know, the economy seems to be doing well. We're getting more revenue as a result of the economy, so you can't have it both ways. You can't say President Trump's killing the economy, but then point to the fact that we got all this excess excess revenue coming in because of Wall Street. So, I think there's a little bit of a contrarian position there that the governor has. So, yes, we had some changes. A lot of them COVID results. Those spending we knew wasn't going to have there. There have been changes in Medicaid, so we are going to get less money for health care. But, the Republicans in Washington would say this is the way we're sustaining the program. It wasn't sustainable if we keep spending the way we've been spending. So I think there's a valid point there. Obviously, I'd like to get as much money as we can from the federal government, because then we can not have to tax our taxpayers as much. Everybody would like that, but that's not a realistic viewpoint.
Thank you so much.